The howling blizzard nearly swallowed Asher Blackburn whole as he urged his exhausted stallion through knee-deep snow, squinting against the biting wind that stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. Grace Redmond's unanswered letters had haunted him for weeks, each passing day without word from the spirited schoolteacher who'd captured his heart the previous spring, turning his worry to dread. 3 days of relentless riding through the brutal Montana winter of 1885 had brought him within sight of her remote cabin, a faint glow of lamplight his only beacon in the growing darkness. "Just a little further, Thunder," Asher murmured to his horse, his gloved hand patting the stallion's frost-covered neck. The animal snorted, warm breath crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. "She's just beyond those trees." Asher had first met Grace at the founding celebration for Silver Creek, a growing settlement where he'd stopped while driving cattle north. Her fiery red hair and quick wit had caught his attention immediately, standing out among the sea of faces at the town dance. That single evening had turned into a week, and then a month, until his duty to the cattle drive forced him to leave, with only promises exchanged and an agreement to write. The memory of her smile sustained him now as he pressed forward, the wind cutting through his heavy coat. Grace had moved to this remote cabin at the edge of Blackfoot territory to teach at the newly established schoolhouse for both settler and native children, her letters describing both the challenges and joys of her position. Her last correspondence, received nearly a month ago, had mentioned feeling unwell but determined to continue her work. When Thunder finally reached the small clearing where Grace's cabin stood, Asher's heart sank. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the brutal cold, and snow had drifted against the door. Sliding from his saddle, his boots crunched in the deep snow as he quickly secured Thunder beneath the small lean to beside the cabin. "Grace," he called, his voice lost in the howling wind as he stumbled toward the cabin door. No response came from within. With fear gripping his chest, Asher pushed against the door, finding it unlocked but partially frozen shut. He threw his weight against it until it gave way, sending him stumbling into the dark interior. "Grace!" he called again, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The cabin was freezing, nearly as cold as outside, with only the faintest glow of dying embers in the fireplace. A figure lay on the small bed in the corner, unmoving beneath a pile of blankets. Asher crossed the room in 3 long strides, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. When he reached the bed, the sight before him made his blood run cold. Grace lay pale and still, her vibrant red hair splayed across the pillow, her normally rosy cheeks ashen. "No," he whispered, falling to his knees beside the bed. With trembling fingers he touched her face, finding her skin alarmingly hot despite the frigid room. "Grace, darlin', can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open, a soft moan escaping her cracked lips. Relief flooded through him. She was alive, but clearly gravely ill. Moving with newfound purpose, Asher rose and went to work. He stoked the dying fire, adding wood from the dwindling pile beside the hearth until flames leapt high, beginning to chase away the bone-deep chill of the cabin. Melting snow in a pot for water, Asher searched Grace's small pantry for anything useful. Finding willow bark tea, he prepared it as his mother had taught him long ago for fevers. As the cabin slowly warmed, he gently lifted Grace's head, coaxing small sips of the bitter liquid between her parched lips. "You've got to fight this, Grace," he murmured, brushing her fiery hair back from her burning forehead. "I didn't ride through hell to lose you now." Hours passed as Asher tended to her, applying cool compresses to her forehead and neck, wringing them out in melted snow water before reapplying them. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering incoherent phrases before slipping back into fevered sleep. By dawn, Asher's own exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but he refused to rest. He'd ventured outside only briefly to tend to thunder and gather more snow to melt for water. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that sparkled beneath the rising sun. "Water," Grace whispered late in the morning, her voice so faint Asher nearly missed it. "I'm here," he said quickly, moving to her side with a cup of fresh water. Supporting her head, he helped her drink, relief washing over him as her eyes finally focused on his face. "Asher?" Confusion clouded her features. "Am I dreaming?" "No dream, darlin'," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm right here." "The letters stopped coming," she murmured, strength already fading as her eyes drifted closed again. "I thought you'd forgotten me." "Never," he promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her fevered brow. "Rest now. I'll be here when you wake." For 3 days and nights, Asher barely slept, dozing only in short stretches while seated in the chair beside Grace's bed. He hunted what game he could find in the snow-covered forest, prepared broth and tea, and kept the fire blazing against the bitter cold. Gradually, Grace's fever began to break, her periods of lucidity growing longer. On the fourth morning, Asher woke from a brief sleep to find Grace watching him, her green eyes clear for the first time since his arrival. "You look terrible," she said softly, a ghost of her familiar teasing smile playing at her lips. Asher laughed despite his exhaustion, the sound rusty from disuse. "You're not exactly at your finest either, Miss Redmond." "How did you know to come?" she asked, slowly pushing herself to sit against the headboard. "Your letters stopped," he said simply, moving to pour her a cup of the willow bark tea that had helped bring her fever down. "And something didn't feel right. I couldn't stay away." Grace accepted the tea with hands that still trembled slightly. "The influenza hit the settlement hard. I was caring for some of the children when I fell ill myself." Her eyes grew distant. "I remember starting a letter to you, but after that, nothing until I saw your face." "You nearly died," Asher said, his voice catching. "When I found you, I thought I might be too late." "But you weren't." Grace reached out, her cool fingers brushing against his stubbled cheek. "You came through that blizzard like some guardian angel." Asher turned his face to press a kiss against her palm. "I'm no angel, Grace, just a man who couldn't bear the thought of a world without you in it." Over the next few days, Grace's strength gradually returned. Asher ventured to the settlement, learning that many had fallen ill with the influenza that had swept through the region. The school had been closed temporarily, giving Grace time to recover fully before returning to her duties. He brought back supplies and news, relieved to hear that while some of the elderly had succumbed to the illness, most of the community was recovering. As Grace grew stronger, Asher found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated. His cattle operation in Wyoming needed him, men were depending on his return, yet the thought of leaving Grace again tore at him. They spoke of many things during her recovery, her passion for teaching both settler and native children despite opposition from some in the community, his struggles to build his ranch into something that would last. "The children will be returning to school soon," Grace said one evening as they sat before the fire, a quilt draped over their laps. The intimacy of their situation hadn't escaped either of them, though Asher had maintained a respectful distance, sleeping on a pallet near the hearth. "Are you strong enough?" he asked, studying her face in the firelight. Color had returned to her cheeks, but he still caught moments when fatigue shadowed her eyes. "I must be," she replied with determination. "These children need education more than anything, especially the Blackfoot children. It's their best hope for navigating the future that's coming, whether we like that future or not." Asher nodded, admiring her conviction even as worry gnawed at him. "And what about you? Who looks after Grace Redmond when she's too busy looking after everyone else?" Her eyes met his, something vulnerable flickering in their green depths. "I've always managed on my own." "But you don't have to," Asher said, reaching to take her hand in his. "Grace, I—" A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. They exchanged surprised glances. Visitors were rare, especially after dark. Asher rose, gesturing for Grace to remain seated as he moved to answer. Standing on the threshold was a tall Blackfoot man wrapped in furs against the cold, his expression grave. "White Eagle," Grace said, rising from her chair. "What brings you here so late?" "Teacher," the man acknowledged with a respectful nod before glancing at Asher with open curiosity. "This is Asher Blackburn," Grace introduced. "He's a dear friend who came to my aid when I fell ill." White Eagle studied Asher for a moment before speaking. "My daughter, Little Dear, has taken ill. My wife fears it is the same sickness that struck the settlement." Grace immediately moved toward her coat hanging by the door. "I'll come at once." Asher caught her arm gently. "You're barely recovered yourself." "Little Dear is one of my brightest students," Grace said firmly. "Her family trusted me enough to send her to school when others wouldn't. I cannot abandon them now." Recognizing the futility of arguing, Asher reached for his own coat. "Then I'm coming with you." The journey to White Eagle's camp took nearly an hour on horseback, with Grace riding double with Asher while White Eagle led the way. The Blackfoot winter camp was nestled in a protected valley, its teepees standing stark against the snow-covered landscape. As they approached, Asher felt curious eyes watching their arrival, the presence of a white man besides their teacher clearly unusual. Inside White Eagle's lodge, they found his wife, Morning Star, kneeling beside a small girl of perhaps 10 years, whose feverish face was painfully familiar to Asher after Grace's illness. "The fever came suddenly," Morning Star explained as Grace knelt beside the child, placing a gentle hand on her forehead. "She was fine yesterday." "It's the influenza," Grace confirmed, her expression grim. Many in the settlement had the same symptoms. For hours, they worked together to treat the child, using both Grace's knowledge of Western medicine and Morning Star's traditional remedies. Asher fetched water and firewood, made himself useful however he could, while observing the respect with which the Blackfoot treated Grace. It was clear she had earned their trust, something rare between settlers and natives in these territories. As dawn approached, Little Dear's fever finally broke. The relief on her parents' faces transcended any cultural differences, the universal love of family evident in every line of their bodies as they embraced. "You honor your promise to teach all children," White Eagle said to Grace as they prepared to leave, the first light of day breaking over the eastern mountains. "My people do not forget such things." "Your daughter is special," Grace replied warmly. "All my students are. I only wish more families would send their children." "Words spread like wind through grass," White Eagle said meaningfully. "After the hard winter, perhaps more will come." The ride back to Grace's cabin was quiet, both of them exhausted from the night's vigil. Asher found himself impressed anew by Grace's dedication and the respect she'd earned from the Blackfoot people. "You've done something remarkable," he said finally as they approached the cabin. "Building trust between worlds that rarely meet peacefully." Grace sighed, leaning against his back as they rode. "It's hardly enough. For every step forward, there are those who push for 2 steps back. The Indian agent makes things difficult, and some settlers resent my teaching native children alongside their own. But you keep doing it anyway," Asher observed. "What choice is there?" Her voice was weary but determined. "The world is changing. Education might give these children a fighting chance." Back at the cabin, they collapsed into exhausted sleep, Grace in her bed and Asher on his pallet by the fire. When they woke late in the afternoon, a comfortable silence settled between them as they moved about the small space, preparing a simple meal together. "I need to return to Wyoming soon," Asher said finally, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Grace's hands stilled where she was slicing bread. "I see." My foreman can handle things for only so long, he continued, hating the necessity. I have men depending on me for their livelihoods. Of course, Grace said, her voice carefully neutral as she resumed her task. You have responsibilities. I understand that better than most. Asher moved to stand beside her, gently taking the knife from her hands and setting it aside. Grace, look at me. When she raised her eyes to his, the vulnerability there nearly undid him. These past days have shown me something I think I've known since I first saw you at that town dance. He said softly, I don't want to leave you again. What are you saying, Asher? She whispered. I'm saying that I love you, he replied, the words both terrifying and liberating. And that I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Grace's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and uncertainty crossing her features. But your ranch, your life in Wyoming, can be moved, he interrupted. Or I can find a way to make both worlds work. What I can't do is ride away from you again without knowing if there's a chance for us. There are complications you haven't considered, she said, though her hands had come to rest against his chest. My work here is important to me. The school, the children. I would never ask you to abandon your calling, Asher assured her. Your passion for teaching is part of what I love about you. I'm asking if there's room in your life for me too. A slow smile spread across Grace's face, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. I think there might be, she said softly. I've missed you terribly these past months. Your letters were what kept me going on the hardest days. Then say you'll marry me, Asher said, taking her hands in his. Not today or tomorrow, but when you're ready. Say you'll let me be part of your life here, that we can build something together. Grace's smile faltered slightly. You should know what you're getting into. Not everyone approves of my teaching Blackfoot children. Some have made threats. All the more reason you shouldn't be alone out here, Asher said firmly. We'll face whatever comes together. For a long moment, Grace simply studied his face, as though searching for any hint of hesitation. Finding none, she finally nodded. Yes, she said, her voice gaining strength. Yes, I'll marry you, Asher Blackburn. The joy that surged through him was unlike anything he'd ever known. Pulling her into his arms, Asher kissed her properly for the first time, pouring every ounce of his feelings into the embrace. Grace responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Asher rested his forehead against hers. I'll still need to return to Wyoming, he said reluctantly, to settle affairs there and make arrangements. I know, Grace replied, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. And I need to finish the school term here. Spring then, Asher suggested. I'll return by spring, and we can be married when the snow melts. Spring, Grace agreed, her smile radiant. A new beginning. The weeks that followed were a flurry of activity as Asher helped Grace prepare for her return to teaching. He repaired the cabin's leaky roof, chopped enough firewood to last through the remainder of winter, and hunted to stock her larder. Together they visited the settlement, where Asher was introduced to the families whose children attended Grace's school. Not all the introductions were warm. The local shopkeeper, Harold Winters, made his disapproval of Grace's teaching practices clear. Educating savages alongside decent folks' children, he muttered just loud enough to be heard as they purchased supplies, ain't natural. Asher's hand tightened on the sack of flour he was holding, but Grace's gentle touch on his arm stayed his response. Mr. Winters, she said pleasantly, I do hope you'll attend our school exhibition next month. Your grandson Thomas has made remarkable progress with his reading. The man harumphed, but couldn't quite meet Grace's steady gaze. We'll see, he said gruffly, turning away to help another customer. You have more patience than I would in your position, Asher remarked, as they loaded their purchases onto Thunder. Patience is a teacher's most valuable tool, Grace replied with a small smile. Besides, his grandson is indeed doing well, and children have a way of changing their elders' perspectives over time. As the day for Asher's departure approached, a sense of impending separation hung over the cabin. They made the most of their evenings, talking late into the night about their dreams for the future. Asher spoke of his hope to establish a horse breeding program alongside his cattle operation, while Grace shared her vision of expanding the school to include adult education. The Blackfoot are being forced to adapt to a changing world, she explained passionately. If they could read contracts and legal documents themselves, they might avoid some of the exploitation they currently face. You dream big, Miss Redmond, Asher said admiringly. Someone has to, she responded with a shrug. And please, after all we've shared, I think you can call me Grace all the time now. The morning of Asher's departure dawned clear and cold, the February sun glinting off the snow-covered landscape. They stood outside the cabin, reluctant to say goodbye despite all their plans. Spring isn't so far away, Grace said, trying to sound cheerful despite the tears threatening to spill onto her cheeks. The longest winter of my life, Asher replied, drawing her into his arms. I'll write at every opportunity. As will I, she promised, and I'll be waiting right here when you return. Their parting kiss was bittersweet, filled with promise and longing. Asher mounted Thunder, taking one last look at Grace standing before her cabin, her red hair catching the morning sun like fire. I love you, Grace Redmond, he called. And I love you, Asher Blackburn, she replied, her voice clear in the still morning air. Come back to me. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he promised, then turned his mount toward Wyoming, already counting the days until spring. The journey back to his ranch was grueling but less dangerous than his desperate ride north had been. As he traveled, Asher's mind raced with plans for the future. His ranch was successful, but would require careful management if he was to split his time between Wyoming and Montana. Perhaps a trusted foreman could be promoted to partner, allowing Asher more freedom to build a life with Grace. When he finally reached his property after 2 weeks of hard riding, his foreman, Marcus Johnson, greeted him with relief and curiosity. Thought we might have lost you to those Montana winters, the older man remarked as they walked toward the main house. Everything's running smooth as can be, though we lost a few head-to-wolves in January. I appreciate you holding things together, Asher said, clapping the man on the shoulder. And I'm going to need to discuss some changes with you. Over the next weeks, Asher threw himself into reorganizing his operation. He promoted Marcus to managing partner with a percentage of the profits, ensuring the man's loyalty and commitment. He also began making arrangements to purchase land near Silver Creek, envisioning a second, smaller ranch that could serve as their main home while still maintaining the Wyoming property. Letters flew back and forth between Asher and Grace, each one strengthening their connection despite the distance. Grace wrote of her students' progress, of tensions with the Indian agent who resented her influence with the Blackfoot, and of her growing excitement about their spring wedding. Asher shared his business arrangements and his progress preparing for their future together, including sketches of the house he hoped to build for them near Silver Creek. As February turned to March, and March began to give way to April, the snow in Wyoming started to melt. Asher grew increasingly restless, eager to return north. A late-season blizzard delayed his departure by a week, leaving him pacing the ranch house like a caged animal while snow piled against the windows. When the storm finally broke, he wasted no time. With his affairs in order and Marcus fully briefed on running things in his absence, Asher packed his saddlebags, mounted a fresh horse, a spirited black gelding he'd named Shadow, and headed north. The journey seemed endless, each mile stretching longer than the last as anticipation built within him. As he crossed into Montana territory, the landscape gradually becoming familiar, Asher found himself pushing harder, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest his mount. He was less than a day's ride from Grace's cabin when he encountered a southbound stagecoach. The driver, recognizing him from his previous stay in Silver Creek, pulled up his team. "Blackburn," the man called. "Heading back to see the schoolmarm, are you?" "That's right," Asher confirmed, an inexplicable unease creeping up his spine at the man's tone. "Something wrong?" The driver spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow beside his coach. "Might say that. There's been trouble up at Silver Creek. That Indian agent, Wilcox, he's been stirring the pot something fierce. Got it in his head the schoolteacher's undermining his authority with the Blackfoot." Alarm shot through Asher. "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing violent yet," the driver assured him. "But there's talk. Ugly talk. Some of the settlers are taking sides. Just thought you should know before you ride in there." "I appreciate the warning," Asher said grimly, already turning shadow northward. "Safe travels." He pushed hard for the remainder of the day, arriving at Grace's cabin just as dusk was settling over the mountains. Relief washed through him at the sight of smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing from the windows. She was home. She was safe. Asher had barely dismounted when the cabin door flew open and Grace appeared, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Asher!" she cried, rushing toward him with no regard for the muddy ground beneath her boots. He caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in a fierce embrace that told him everything he needed to know, whatever troubles might lie ahead. This moment, this woman, was worth any hardship. "You're early," Grace said when he finally set her down, her eyes drinking in the sight of him. "Couldn't stay away another day," he replied honestly, cupping her face in his hands. "God, I've missed you." Inside the cabin, over a simple dinner of rabbit stew, Grace confirmed what the stagecoach driver had told him. Indian Agent Wilcox had indeed begun a campaign against her school, claiming she was encouraging the Blackfoot to resist reservation life by giving them false hope through education. "He's pressuring the territorial authorities to revoke my teaching credentials," Grace explained, her expression troubled but determined. "And he's convinced some of the settlers that I'm putting their children at risk by having them learn alongside Blackfoot students." "The driver mentioned there's been talk," Asher said carefully. "Has anyone threatened you directly?" Grace hesitated just long enough for Asher to know the truth before she shook her head. "Nothing worth mentioning, just the usual disapproving glances. A few parents withdrawing their children." "Grace," Asher said firmly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "No more secrets between us. If we're to face this together, I need to know everything." She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "There have been incidents, nothing I couldn't handle, a broken window at the schoolhouse, some unpleasant notes left on my door." Anger flared in Asher's chest. "And you didn't think to mention this in your letters?" "I didn't want to worry you when you were so far away," Grace defended. "And truly, Asher, it's nothing I haven't dealt with before. Change never comes easily, especially here." "Things are different now," he reminded her. "You're not alone anymore." A soft smile touched her lips. "No, I'm not. And you can't imagine how grateful I am for that fact." The following morning, they rode together to the settlement. Asher wanted to assess the situation for himself and make his presence known to those who might wish Grace harm. The small schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple one-room building with a small bell tower. Inside, a dozen desks faced a blackboard, with shelves of books lining one wall, many of them, Asher noted, purchased with Grace's own limited funds. "It's not much," she said, watching him examine the space. "But we make do." "It's perfect," he replied honestly. "I can see why you love it here." Their arrival in town caused a stir, with many people stopping to watch as they made their way to the general store. Some faces were friendly, nodding in greeting, while others turned away deliberately. The division Grace had described was clearly evident. Inside the store, Harold Winters was engaged in heated conversation with a well-dressed man whose pompous bearing immediately put Asher on edge. "Miss Redmond," the man said, turning at their entrance with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "How fortuitous. I was just discussing the school situation with Mr. Winters here." "Agent Wilcox?" Grace acknowledged stiffly. "May I introduce Asher Blackburn, my fiancé?" Wilcox's eyebrows rose as he extended a hand toward Asher. "Indeed? I wasn't aware you were engaged, Miss Redmond. Congratulations are in order, I suppose." Asher shook the offered hand firmly, perhaps more firmly than strictly necessary. "I understand you have concerns about Grace's teaching methods." "Not concerns, Mr. Blackburn, certainties," Wilcox corrected, his tone condescending. "Miss Redmond's insistence on educating Blackfoot children alongside settlers creates unrealistic expectations and undermines official policy regarding the tribes." "And what policy might that be?" Asher asked, keeping his tone neutral despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Progress, Mr. Blackburn. The Indians must adapt or perish. That is the simple truth of our expanding nation." Wilcox straightened his already impeccable jacket. "Teaching them to read Shakespeare won't help them when they're confined to reservations, which is the inevitable outcome." Grace stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "Teaching them to read might help them understand the treaties your office keeps modifying to their disadvantage." "Careful, Miss Redmond," Wilcox warned, his pleasant facade slipping. "Such accusations border on sedition. Your position here is already precarious." "Is that a threat, Agent Wilcox?" Asher asked quietly, moving slightly closer to Grace. "Merely an observation of fact," the man replied smoothly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have official business to attend to. Good day to you both." As Wilcox departed, Harold Winters watched them with undisguised hostility. "You'd do well to listen to the agent," he said to Grace. "Folk around here are getting tired of your troublemaking." "Is providing education troublemaking now, Mr. Winters?" Grace challenged, her voice steady despite the tension Asher could feel radiating from her. "Your grandson has improved remarkably this term. His reading is nearly at grade level now." The shopkeeper's face reddened. "Leave my family out of this. Thomas won't be returning to your school. My daughter's decided to send him to her sisters in Helena." The hurt that flashed across Grace's face was quickly masked, but Asher saw it clearly. Thomas had been one of her favorite students, judging from her letters. "That's a shame," she said finally. "He has real potential." They completed their shopping in strained silence, Winters barely acknowledging them as he tallied their purchases. Outside, Asher loaded the supplies onto their horses while Grace stood lost in thought. "You see what we're up against?" she said finally. "It's not just Wilcox. Many of the settlers agree with him. And many don't," Asher pointed out. "I saw plenty of friendly faces as we rode in." He secured the last package and turned to face her. "Grace, if this is becoming dangerous—" "Don't," she interrupted, her green eyes flashing. "Don't suggest I abandon my students or my principles." "I can't, Asher. I won't." "I wasn't going to," he assured her, taking her hands in his. "I was going to say, if it's becoming dangerous, we need to be smarter about how we proceed. Build allies, create a strategy that protects both you and the school." Relief washed over her face. "You're not asking me to give up?" "I fell in love with your determination and courage," Asher reminded her with a smile. "Asking you to give up would be like asking the sun not to rise." Their return to the cabin was interrupted by the arrival of White Eagle and several other Blackfoot men. The tension in their postures was evident even before they spoke. "Teacher," White Eagle greeted Grace formally, "we must talk." Inside the cabin, the Blackfoot men related troubling news. Agent Wilcox had visited their winter camp, threatening to withhold already promised supplies if they continued sending their children to Grace's school. He says government policy now forbids education except on reservation, White Eagle explained, his weathered face grave. Says our children must go to mission school there, or receive no schooling at all. He can't do that, Grace protested. There's no such policy. Perhaps not. Another man, whom Grace introduced as Running Bear, said quietly. But he controls the supplies our families need to survive. Food, blankets, medicine. The implication hung heavy in the air. No matter how much the Blackfoot valued education, they couldn't sacrifice their children's immediate survival. What if we provided those supplies? Asher suggested suddenly. All eyes turned to him. My ranch produces more than enough to share, and I have connections with traders who could supply blankets, tools, whatever's needed. White Eagle studied him intently. Why would you do this? Because I believe in what Grace is doing, Asher replied honestly, and because I know what it's like to have someone try to take your future away. The Blackfoot men conferred briefly in their own language before White Eagle spoke again. Your offer shows a good heart, but Wilcox would still find ways to punish our people. Then we need to remove Wilcox, Grace said, determination hardening her voice. The Indian Affairs Office in Helena has oversight of the agents. If we can document his abuses of power, his threats, they might replace him. It would take time, Running Bear pointed out. Time our children don't have if they miss this year's schooling. Then we continue in secret, Grace proposed. I can come to your camp, teach there until this is resolved. It's not ideal, but... No, White Eagle interrupted firmly. Too dangerous for you. Wilcox has eyes everywhere. The discussion continued late into the evening, examining every possible approach. Finally, a compromise was reached. The children would continue attending school, but in smaller, staggered groups that would attract less attention. Meanwhile, Grace would begin documenting every interaction with Wilcox, building a case against him for the territorial authorities. After the Blackfoot men departed, Grace sank into a chair by the fire, the weight of the situation evident in the slump of her shoulders. Asher knelt before her, taking her hands in his. We'll find a way through this, he promised. Together. Grace managed a tired smile. I knew teaching here would be challenging, but I never expected to find myself in a political battle with the U.S. government. You've never backed down from a fight that matters, Asher said. It's one of the many reasons I love you. And you? She asked softly. This isn't what you signed up for when you proposed marriage. A quiet life with the schoolteacher has turned into something far more complicated. Asher laughed, the sound warm in the quiet cabin. Grace Redmond, if I wanted a quiet life, I would have married the banker's daughter back in St. Louis, who my mother kept throwing in my path. I chose the fiery redhead who challenges everything and everyone around her. I knew exactly what I was getting into. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of caution and defiance. Grace continued teaching, adapting her methods to accommodate smaller groups, and sometimes holding lessons in unusual locations, the back room of the sympathetic blacksmith's shop, the home of a settler who supported her cause, even occasionally in the woods when weather permitted. Asher divided his time between helping Grace and establishing their future. He purchased land just outside Silver Creek, making arrangements for a house to be built that would accommodate both their needs, a proper study for Grace's teaching materials, and a stable large enough for the horses he planned to breed. He also made regular trips to White Eagle's camp, bringing supplies to offset what Wilcox had withheld. Their wedding plans progressed despite the tensions. Grace had few family connections her parents had passed years ago, and her only brother lived in California, but the community that supported her rallied around the upcoming celebration. The blacksmith's wife offered to help with Grace's dress, while the local pastor, though cautious about openly defying Wilcox, agreed to perform the ceremony. A week before their planned wedding day, disaster struck. Grace returned from teaching to find her cabin ransacked, her carefully documented evidence against Wilcox missing, along with her teaching materials and books. "This changes nothing," she insisted as Asher helped her restore order to the chaos. "We'll start again. I have copies of some documents stored at the school." "Grace," Asher said gently, picking up a torn photograph of her parents from the floor. "This wasn't just about the evidence. This was a warning." She paused in her cleaning, her face paling slightly. "You think they'll come back?" "I think you shouldn't stay here alone anymore," Asher replied firmly. "The wedding is in a week. Move into town until then. Stay with the blacksmith's family. They've offered. And let them intimidate me into abandoning my home? My students?" Grace shook her head stubbornly. "I won't give Wilcox the satisfaction." Their argument was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless young Blackfoot boy, Little Dear's brother, who had run all the way from the settlement. "Teacher," he gasped, "they are burning the school." Asher and Grace arrived in Silver Creek to find the schoolhouse engulfed in flames. A small crowd gathered to watch. Some faces showed horror, others grim satisfaction. Agent Wilcox stood at the edge of the crowd, ostensibly directing efforts to prevent the fire from spreading to nearby buildings, though no real attempt was being made to save the school itself. "Who did this?" Grace demanded, her voice cutting through the crackle of flames. "An unfortunate accident, I'm told," Wilcox replied smoothly, turning to face her. "Oil lamp overturned. These things happen in primitive conditions." "The lamps were secured to the walls," Grace said through clenched teeth. "And the school was closed today. There should have been no lamps lit at all." Wilcox shrugged, his expression one of practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps you forgot one in your haste this morning. In any case, it appears your educational experiment has come to its natural conclusion." Asher stepped forward, positioning himself between Grace and the agent. "This was deliberate," he said quietly, his voice carrying only to Wilcox. "And we both know who's responsible." "Careful, Mr. Blackburn," Wilcox warned. "Accusations of arson are serious matters, particularly when directed at a federal agent." "So is destroying government property," Asher countered. "That schoolhouse was built with territorial funds." A flash of uncertainty crossed Wilcox's face before his smooth mask returned. "Indeed it was. A regrettable loss for the community. Perhaps when a new school is eventually built, a more conventional teacher can be found." As the agent walked away, Grace sagged against Asher's side. "Everything was in there," she whispered. "All my books, my students' work, the remaining evidence we'd gathered." Around them, the crowd began to disperse as the schoolhouse collapsed in on itself, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. A few townspeople approached Grace with awkward expressions of sympathy, while others hurried away, avoiding her gaze entirely. Harold Winters paused as he passed them. "Shame about the school," he said, his tone making it clear he felt anything but regret. "Perhaps it's a sign you should consider other opportunities, Miss Redmond. I hear they need teachers back east where things are more civilized." Before Grace could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "My grandson was reading last night," Winter's daughter said quietly, approaching with a young boy, Thomas, at her side. "Reading from the Bible all on his own, Pa. He couldn't do that before Miss Redmond taught him." Winters frowned at his daughter. "Mary, this isn't the time." "When is the time?" she challenged. "When Thomas grows up unable to read contracts or deeds because you were too proud to stand up to men like Wilcox." The shopkeeper's face reddened, but before he could reply, Thomas tugged at his grandfather's sleeve. "Miss Redmond taught me good, Grandpa," the boy said earnestly. "And Little Dear helped me with my sums when I got stuck. She's real smart." Something shifted in Winter's expression, not a complete transformation, but a crack in his certainty. Be that as it may, he said gruffly. The school's gone now. Buildings can be rebuilt, Grace said, finding her voice again. Education doesn't require four walls and a roof. It requires commitment and courage from teachers, students, and communities. As darkness fell and the last embers of the schoolhouse glowed red against the night sky, Asher and Grace returned to her cabin. The destruction of the school had shaken her deeply, but as they rode, Asher felt her straighten in the saddle, her natural resilience reasserting itself. They think they've won, she said as they approached the cabin. But this isn't over. No, it's not, Asher agreed, reaching across to squeeze her hand. We still have our wedding in a week. And after that, we start rebuilding the school, the community's trust, everything. Inside, as they prepared a simple meal, a plan began to form between them. The wedding would proceed as scheduled, but they would use the gathering to rally support for a new school. With Asher's resources and Grace's determination, they could rebuild faster and better than before. Wilcox won't stop, Grace warned as they sat before the fire later that evening. He'll find new ways to interfere. Let him try, Asher replied confidently. He's one man with limited authority. We have an entire community, both settler and Blackfoot, who benefit from what you're doing. We need to be strategic, Grace mused. The territorial governor is visiting Helena next month. If we could arrange an audience, present our case directly. I have connections in Helena, Asher offered, business associates who might help secure that meeting. As they talked into the night, refining their approach, the destruction of the schoolhouse gradually transformed from a devastating setback to a catalyst for something larger. By morning, both were energized by new purpose. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day that seemed to herald new beginnings. Despite the recent troubles, or perhaps because of them, attendance was higher than expected. Settlers who had remained neutral in the conflict with Wilcox came to show their support, and to everyone's surprise, White Eagle arrived with several families from his band, their presence a bold statement of solidarity. Grace was radiant in a simple white dress with blue ribbons, her red hair crowned with wildflowers gathered by the Blackfoot children she taught. Asher, waiting at the front of the small church, felt his heart swell at the sight of her walking toward him, her green eyes shining with love and determination. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows exchanged with a depth of commitment that went beyond the traditional words. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests seemed to represent more than just celebration of their union. It was affirmation of the community they were building. At the reception held in the town hall, Asher noticed Agent Wilcox standing at the back of the room, his expression carefully neutral as he observed the proceedings. Rather than allowing the man's presence to cast a shadow over their day, Asher approached him directly, Grace at his side. Agent Wilcox, he greeted cordially. I'm surprised to see you here. Professional interest, Mr. Blackburn, Wilcox replied smoothly. It's my job to monitor significant gatherings in the territory, particularly when they involve certain elements of the population. His gaze drifted meaningfully toward the Blackfoot guests. Then I hope you're taking careful notes, Grace said, her voice pleasant but firm. Because what you're witnessing is the future of this territory's settlers and Blackfoot celebrating together, their children playing and learning side by side. Wilcox's smile tightened. A charming vision, Mrs. Blackburn. Naive, but charming. Time will tell, Asher responded, his arm around Grace's waist. In the meantime, you should know we've secured an audience with Governor Hauser when he visits Helena next month. We'll be discussing educational opportunities in the territory and the obstacles certain officials have placed in their way. The agent's composure slipped for just a moment, surprise and concern flashing across his features before he recovered. The governor is a busy man. I doubt he'll have much time for school matters. On the contrary, Asher countered. He expressed particular interest when he learned about a federal agent destroying territorial property to advance his personal agenda. That's a serious accusation, Wilcox said, his voice hardening. With serious evidence to support it, Grace added. Did you think the documents you stole from my cabin were the only copies, or that the schoolhouse held all our proof? It was a bluff. Much of their evidence had indeed been lost, but Wilcox didn't need to know that. The uncertainty in his eyes suggested the gambit was working. If you'll excuse us, Asher said pleasantly, we have guests to attend to. Enjoy the celebration, Agent Wilcox. It represents everything you've failed to prevent. As they walked away, Grace squeezed Asher's hand. That was rather bold, she murmured. Sometimes boldness is required, he replied with a smile. Besides, it's not entirely a bluff. I did write to the governor, and we do have an appointment, though perhaps not as firm as I implied. Asher Blackburn? Grace laughed. You're becoming quite the strategist. I learned from the best, he said, drawing her close for a quick kiss that drew cheers from nearby guests. The celebration continued into the evening, a joyous affirmation of their union and the community they were building. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit throughout the town hall, Asher led Grace outside for a moment of quiet beneath the stars. Happy? He asked softly, tucking a stray strand of her fiery hair behind her ear. More than I ever thought possible, she replied, leaning into his touch. Even with everything that's happened, I wouldn't change a thing. Not even the schoolhouse burning down? Asher teased gently. Well, perhaps that, Grace admitted with a small smile. But even that disaster has brought people together who might otherwise have remained apart. Did you see Thomas introducing his grandfather to Little Deer? Or the blacksmith offering his workshop for classes until we rebuild? Asher nodded, marveling at her ability to find hope in the darkest situations. That's what I love about you, Grace Blackburn. You see possibilities where others see only problems. And you, she said, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him, make those possibilities reality. Their journey was just beginning, with challenges still to face and battles still to fight. But as they stood together under the Montana stars, newly wed and fully committed to each other and the community they served, both knew they had found something rare and precious, a love strong enough to weather any storm, and a purpose worthy of that love's power. The meeting with Governor Hauser proved more successful than either had dared hope. Impressed by their dedication and disturbed by the evidence they presented of Wilcox's abuses, the governor promised an investigation. Within 2 months, Wilcox was reassigned to a desk position in Washington, replaced by a more progressive agent who, while not entirely supportive of Grace's educational approach, at least didn't actively sabotage it. The new schoolhouse, built with funds from Asher's businesses and labor donated by both settler and Blackfoot families, opened in the fall. Larger and better equipped than its predecessor, it featured separate rooms for different age groups and a small library filled with books Asher had ordered from as far away as Boston. As winter approached again, nearly a year after Asher's desperate ride through the snow to Grace's cabin, the couple stood on the porch of their new home overlooking Silver Creek. The house, completed just weeks earlier, combined the practical needs of frontier life with touches of elegance, large windows to capture the mountain views, bookshelves lining the walls of their shared study, and a wide hearth around which students sometimes gathered for special lessons. Hard to believe it's been a year, Asher remarked, his arm around Grace's shoulders as they watched the first snowflakes begin to fall. So much has changed. And yet some things remain constant, Grace replied, resting her head against his chest. Her hand drifted to her slightly rounded belly, still barely noticeable beneath her dress. Our family is growing, just like our community. The news of their coming child had brought them both immeasurable joy, though Grace had insisted on continuing to teach until nature forced her to rest. The school now employed a second teacher, a young woman from Helena who shared Grace's vision, ensuring the classes would continue uninterrupted during Grace's confinement. "I've been thinking," Asher said, watching the snow begin to coat the landscape in white, "about adding a classroom specifically for adult education in the spring. Many of the Blackfoot men have expressed interest in learning reading and mathematics to better understand contracts and trade." "That's a wonderful idea," Grace enthused, her eyes lighting up. "White Eagle mentioned something similar to me last week. He believes education is their best defense against further loss of land and rights." "He's a wise man," Asher agreed. "And speaking of White Eagle, he invited us to attend their winter ceremony next week. He says they wish to honor our child with a special blessing." Grace's eyes filled with happy tears. "That's an incredible honor. Few outsiders are ever invited to such ceremonies." "We're not outsiders anymore," Asher said softly. "That's what we've built here, a place where boundaries begin to blur and people see each other as neighbors, not strangers." As darkness fell and the snow continued to drift down, they moved inside to the warmth of their home. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden light across the room filled with books, maps, and mementos of their journey together. "Do you ever think about that night?" Grace asked as they settled on the sofa before the fire. "When you found me ill and collapsed beside my bed?" "More often than you might imagine," Asher admitted, drawing her close against his side. "It was the most terrifying moment of my life, seeing you so still and pale. But also, the moment I knew with absolute certainty that my life was bound to yours, no matter what came next." "I remember fragments," Grace said softly. "The feel of your hand on my brow, the sound of your voice urging me to fight. Even in my delirium, I knew you'd come back to me." "Always," Asher promised, his hand covering hers where it rested on her growing belly. "Through blizzards, bureaucrats, and whatever else life throws our way." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white much as it had on that fateful night. But inside their home, warmth and love created a haven against the cold, not just for them, but for the child they would welcome in the spring, and for the community that had become their extended family. Their story, like the frontier itself, was still being written, each chapter bringing new challenges and unexpected joys. But the foundation they had built together, a love forged in adversity and strengthened through shared purpose, would endure long after the snows of winter melted away, nurturing the promise of all that was yet to come.